The story of Jack the Ripper is perhaps one of the most prolific legends of all time, eventually turning into the basis of many folklore stories and becoming a household name in the world of true crime. For those who don't know, Jack the Ripper, then known as the Whitechapel Murderer, was an unknown person who terrorized the streets of Whitechapel, London in 1888. Most often thought to be a man, he sought after the impoverished citizens of the area, grossly mutilating them and leaving them to pass away on the streets. England had seen an influx in immigrants during this time, and the city was starting to become overpopulated. This is what the murderer thrived on. There were actually 11 murders committed during the years of 1888 to 1891, though only 5 of those 11 are attributed to Jack the Ripper. These women were Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. According to sources, all were murdered at night and all were murdered on or near the weekend, usually at the beginning or end of the month. After those 5 women, he was gone, just as quickly as he had come, leaving no evidence behind other than the grief-stricken families of those whose lives he had taken and a handful of letters said to have been written by the killer himself. These letters can be found online, and I'll link them below for anyone interested. They outlined his previous murders, plans for future murders, and even included human body parts in some of the parcels. To this day, the mystery of Jack the Ripper has never been solved. Many believe that after the murders, the killer died, was jailed on other charges, or immigrated elsewhere, thus saving the city from further grief. A vast majority of the documents relating to the Whitechapel murders were lost in the Blitz during World War II. The files that remained were never able to give a definite insight into the true identity of the Whitechapel murderer. But what if Jack the Ripper never completely stopped? It's happened before in more modern times, with the BTK killer waiting nearly 8 years between 2 of his victims. What if Jack the Ripper simply slipped back into the darkness for a while, only to return nearly a decade later with a different MO that would surely keep him from getting caught? Or what if the popularity of his slayings paved the way for another murderer years later? After all, in London during the summer of 1897, there were over 25 bodies found in the River Thames, with 17 of them being found within the short span of just 3 weeks, and many of the investigations having never reached a formal conclusion on what led to the drowned bodies. So what was really going on near the River Thames in the summer of 1897? June 22nd was the set date for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee to enter London. This was a huge deal, not only because the Diamond Jubilee is a celebration for the 60th year of a ruler's reign, but also because in 1896, Queen Victoria had just surpassed her father as the longest reigning monarch in British history, but wanted to save the celebration until 1897. In the weeks leading up to the Jubilee, officials were preparing for the Queen's arrival and were preoccupied with assembling the festivities. Additionally, there were many citizens arriving to London throughout June to join in the Queen's celebration activities. The storm of commotion surrounding the Jubilee would have created the perfect opportunity for a serial killer to carry out the string of deaths that were to come. The deaths came in droves, starting at the beginning of June and lasting through mid-July, with a few outliers later on in the year. One after another, the headlines read, "Thames Mystery," "Drowned in the Thames," and "More Bodies in the Thames." While I have a few theories of my own that I will discuss, I'll leave you to make up your mind on what was happening in 1897. Since these events occurred over 120 years ago, they are a bit of a struggle to put together in perfect order, but I'll try my best to present them to you in a comprehensive timeline. Additionally, it's important to note the legal verbiage of the time. For the purpose of this video, the verdict of found drowned means that there was no foul play suspected in the death. This could have been an accidental death or a probable suicide. Alternatively, an open verdict means that the death is suspicious and the jurors were not able to come to a conclusion on what the cause of death was. It began slowly on June 3rd with the death of an unknown man who committed suicide off the London Bridge. This man was never identified. Then, on June 4th of 1897, perhaps one of the most perplexing of all the deaths occurred. A naked woman who I will refer to as the Bengal Woman was found in the River Thames near North Woolwich by a dock laborer on his way to Albert Docks. The name Bengal Woman comes from the fact that she was found wearing nothing except 2 bangles, one on each wrist. Papers stated that she was around the age of 30, and though many attempts have been made to identify her, she remains unidentified to this day. Her lack of clothing wasn't the most striking concern, however. The woman had been found with deep lacerations across her entire face and bruises on her limbs, originally thought to have been done in an attempt to prevent her from being identified. Later on, the question was asked whether the cuts had been made pre- or post-mortem, and whether they could have been done by a passing ship propeller. In either case, returning an open verdict, the coroner stated that the bruises had been inflicted prior to the death, and the jury assumed she had probably been a victim of foul play of some sort. Then later that same day, a man named John Mabin was ruled to have taken his own life and was found off the river near Woolwich, passing away of pneumonia and immersion in the Woolwich Union Infirmary. On the 5th of June, a man named Edmund was found in the river after a collision of 2 ships in the River Thames, though it was ruled to be an accidental death. The next day, the 6th of June, a man named Walter, only 23 years old, was found in the Grosvenor Canal after heading to work. Though he had stated to a friend that he had just gotten out of a relationship with a girl, the jury did not believe this contributed to his death and returned an open verdict. A few days passed until the 10th of June, when a barrage of deaths swept the Thames. It began with William Turner, who attempted suicide from the Tower Bridge, but was later saved by a passing police boat. Interesting to note, the attempt of suicide was actually considered a crime if one did not succeed up until 1961, and William was placed into custody for a week for his said crime. Later, on the 10th, a newspaper reported that 4 bodies had been found nude within the last 5 days. The first was found in Chamberlain's Wharf, now the location of the London Bridge Hospital. It was a man around the age of 20, and the coroner stated that he'd been in the water around 3 months, though he was not identified. Additionally, 3 more bodies were found in the Thames, including the Bengal Woman in Woolwich, and 2 more in Rotherhithe and Bermondsey. I was not able to find any information on these other 2 bodies other than the small blurb, so it begs the question as to whether they were ever identified and whether their deaths were ruled accidental or not. The 11th gave way to 2 more bodies, that of Marianne Coleman, who was widowed and had recently discharged herself from a workhouse, and Lillian, who had been acting strange on the nights before her death. According to newspapers, she had been courting a man named George, though he was never charged with her death. She left her home on the night of her death and was found drowned in the river the next morning, with a small bottle of gin on her person. In this case, an open verdict was returned. June 12th was much the same as the 11th. 2 more bodies found. One was of an unidentified man in ragged clothing near Temple Station. To this day, I couldn't find any evidence that he was ever identified. That same day, the accidental drowning of a man named McPherson happened from falling into the river after a sunstroke. Few days passed before the next list of bodies appeared in the papers. These deaths would be the ones that would puzzle the citizens of the River Thames once and for all. On the 16th of June, the body of a, quote, fashionably dressed lady was found floating near Mark Brown's wharf, wearing multiple gold and silver rings and clothing made of the best material, including a cloak made of velvet and astrakhan that would have cost somewhere between roughly 300 to 500 pounds in modern currency. It was later reported that the woman had been in the water for approximately 1 week and that her identity was that of Amelia Ward, a chambermaid at the Hotel Cecil. Word came out that she had been courting a married man, though authorities were never able to tie him to her drowning. The verdict came back as found drowned since there were no obvious signs of trauma. Still, authorities were suspicious as to how she came to be in the position that she was in. That same day, the body of a, quote, well-dressed man was found in the River Thames at Denton, around 2 miles away from Gravesend. According to newspapers, the deceased's hands were tied behind his back and a stone was attached to the cord. The man was roughly 50 years old and had apparently spoken to multiple pier workers earlier in the day with no sign of suicidal ideation. The man had purchased a boat for a row and no one had heard from him until his body was found. The boat, at that time, had not yet been found and I am unsure that it ever was. Authorities eventually attributed his death to foul play, citing that the man would not have been able to tie the cord behind his back and that the man had been showing a decent amount of money, but only 5 shillings was found on his person. It was later reported that there were 2 more bodies found on the 16th in the Thames. One opposite of the St. Thomas Hospital with a handkerchief marked C.E. Reed, M-U-O-O-K, and one in the water off the Lion Brewery, Charing Cross Bridge, which had several pieces of bedding paper in his pocket, along with a paper bearing the initials H.B. and B.B. At this point, reporters stated that there had now been 17 bodies found over the last 3 weeks in the River Thames, the most that had ever been found in such a short period of time. On June 17th, 4 additional bodies were found. The first was that of Robert Smith, a tax collector in Wandsworth, who was found floating off the Fresh Wharf at the London Bridge. Later, 2 more bodies were found in Westminster and 1 body was found at Silverton. Since the other 2 additional bodies on the 16th and the 4 bodies on the 17th were so close in range, I'm uncertain as to whether any of these bodies may be the same, but reported separately due to miscommunication or other information available at the time. Considering where each body was found, it seems that they were all different men, found in very short succession, bringing the body count throughout a single month up to 21 bodies. After this last large reporting, the amount of bodies found in the Thames seemed to dwindle a bit. June 22nd gave way to the Queen's Jubilee, and the next body was not reported until the 24th when a man named John Cooper seized suddenly while bathing and accidentally drowned. On the 27th of June, another unknown man, around the age of 50, was found floating off the Temple by a police officer. It was never reported whether this case was an act of foul play or an accident. On the 8th of July, a man named George Henry Cox was found drowned off Shadwell. He stated to another man that he had had a dream that he would be drowned at 8 p.m. that night, and nothing had been seen of him since. The jury was unable to determine whether foul play was involved, and his death returned a verdict of found drowned. Then, on June 10th, a quote, respectably dressed young woman of roughly 30 years old was found in the River Thames near the Tower Bridge. This woman was never identified, even though she had a tattoo of the words, I love FR on her left leg and arm. The woman's clothing was marked WR. For her drowning, an open verdict was returned. By July 29th, one of the last Thames bodies was found, this of a young woman who was also respectably dressed, around the age of 25, who was found close to the Needle Steps. She remains unidentified, though she was found shortly after her death, according to the coroner. The coroner was not able to find any signs of violence, but the inquest returned an open verdict as the jury could not come to a decision on how she had ended up in the water. And just like that, within less than 2 months, roughly 26 bodies were found within less than 20 miles of each other. My current theories are as follows. Could it have been the work of a serial killer such as Jack the Ripper? After all, the Whitechapel area of London was only a quick 20-minute walk away from the River Thames. In the 1800s, it would have been simple for a killer to move to a different part of town and change up their MO to avoid getting caught. Or was it the work of an opportunistic killer or killers, knowing that the authorities would be too busy setting up the Queen's Jubilee to pay attention to a string of deaths that could be classified as accidental if they were careful enough? Or was it just a series of accidents, suicides, and maybe a personal murder sprinkled in here and there? An article written in July of 1897 spoke about the epidemic of suicide during this year, citing that many different suicides had happened within the end of June and early July. In fact, around the end of the 1800s, roughly 25 in every 100,000 men and 6 in every 100,000 women had committed suicide in England and Wales, this being topped only slightly by suicide rates during the Great Depression. Additionally, around 35 bodies are found in the River Thames per year, which comes out to about 3 bodies per month, with the majority of these deaths being attributed to suicide. With so little information aside from articles published in local London newspapers, it's hard to make a definite conclusion of what went on in London and the surrounding towns during 1897. There were other murders that took place throughout the year, like that of Henry Baxter, who was found in the Thames in September with his throat slashed, and Lily Cheeseman, a barmaid who was found in the Thames in October. Lily's death was considered foul play as well, though it was never solved. These 2 deaths may have been connected to some of the prior 26 deaths, though they did occur outside of the time frame when many of the murders were happening. The Thames bodies of 1897 are an anomaly, and though most will likely never be solved due to the passage of time, there's still an interesting facet of history to read through via newspaper articles, and there's still someone's family. There's a large possibility that these people never knew what happened to their ancestors, but I hope one day these families will find the answers they're looking for, even if it is 130 years after the fact. If you have any other odds and ends of history or the present day that you'd like me to cover, please comment or reach out to me on Twitter and let me know. I'm always open to researching new topics to try to give a full story. With that being said, I hope you've enjoyed listening to this deep dive as much as I enjoyed digging into it. I'll be back next time with some more paper trails.